as we have with the other schools of thought we've looked at, we want to ask about constructivist ethics. What kinds of normative claims does constructivism make? And here we get to a fairly ironic answer, which is while constructivism is the school of thought that says norms are really important, constructivism actually doesn't have its own normative position. It simply says norms are socially constructed and they shape behavior, but we're not going to tell you what they should be. Constructivists get their norms from the other paradigms that they might happen to subscribe to, right? Economic structuralism or liberalism or realism or something else. So that's a little, again, I think strange or ironic that the school of thought that says norms are most important doesn't have their own set of norms that they kind of want to sell to us. But their focus on the importance of norms and on shared norms in particular leads to an important role in changing the world. So for those people who do want to change the world for some sort of normative reason, constructivism gives an important argument about how you might do that. So if cooperation depends on shared norms, then people who want to have cooperation on some issue, X or Y or Z, might want to promote shared norms in that particular area. So for example, people around the world try to convince all the governments of the world to agree on a single set of targets, a single set of standards. For example, 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or other single standards, because once there's a single standard, presumably it will be easier to come to some sort of climate change agreement. Same thing on human rights. People around the world try to spread shared norms of human rights, for example, against the death penalty, against torture as a way of getting confessions, and on and on and on. And trying to get those things shared as a way of creating the world that they would like to see. And so some constructivist scholars have created this concept of transnational advocacy networks, which are groups of people in different countries all working together, but also within their own countries, to try to push countries towards shared norms as a way of accomplishing things across countries that are really important. And we'll talk more about transnational advocacy networks fairly soon. There are also, of course, efforts to undermine norms. So for example, for many, many years, or centuries really, there was a norm that you're not supposed to interfere in the affairs of another state, right? That was sort of the key norm of the Westphalian system. But after the end of the Cold War, when we had first ethnic cleansing or genocide in the former Yugoslavia, and then something similar on a much bigger scale in Rwanda, a lot of people really began to question that norm, because that norm was seen as clashing with other important norms like human rights. And so the norm of non-intervention really eroded in a lot of ways, and that made a lot of people mad, not least of which was Russia, who saw itself sort of losing allies because of that. Russia itself now, if we think about identity, Russia has done a lot in recent years to try to undermine the notion of Europe. To undermine Europe as an identity, and in particular to help countries like Hungary, for example, adopt more, let's say, non-democratic practices as a way of undermining the identity of Europe. So norms then, in this view, become things that people battle over. And of course, realists would be fairly comfortable with that idea. Liberals are more comfortable with the idea of people getting together to promote the norms that are needed to build cooperation. So one idea of power, and what I really want to talk about for a few more minutes is power in constructivism, is this notion of soft power. Power not as the ability to coerce, but as attractiveness, social influence. Reputation, admiration, or the word I already used was attraction. It's the ability to get others to accept your norms or to want to be like you without having to coerce them or tell them what to do. Now, the guy who originally came up with this idea, a guy named Joseph Nye, saw it in the context of the United States and saw it as being very passive. That is to say, the United States, he argued, benefited a great deal from its relationships and its values and its reputation around the world and the fact that it was admired around the world. And he called this soft power. What we see now, as others have begun to get into this notion, is states trying to actively deploy soft power as a way for getting goals. So in a way, blurring the distinctions between soft power and hard power. So you see the government of Qatar, for example, using all kinds of means, and let's be honest, basically bribery, to win the World Cup because it's seen as building the reputation of Qatar, and of course, buying the Paris Saint-Germain soccer team and pouring billions of dollars into that as a way of, again, sort of building the reputation of the state. And you see Russia with a very sophisticated campaign, not only all the stuff on Facebook, but with English language news channels and so on and so forth, using the Russian Orthodox Church, which is active around the world, to try to build up this idea that Russia is a good, admirable country, and you should want the things that Russia wants. So soft power itself has kind of become weaponized. And that gets to a broader point about power. Once you recognize that in shared norms, there is power, there is the ability to shape outcomes, or let me put it differently, to the extent that you see shared norms as potentially shaping outcomes, you begin to see them as a form of power, and so you want to get involved in that. Instead of forcing others to do what you want, it's much cheaper if you can do it to get them to want what you want. And this gets onto this notion of structural power, which is essentially the ability to define the debate such that hopefully people take for granted the values that you're trying to sell without them ever even debating it or thinking about it, right? And that, while this is called structural power, again, a little bit of an irony or confusion, this is the kind of power that post-structuralists are most determined to sort of put in the foreground and have us really focus on and begin to question and uncover. So we'll end up with a question. How compelling do you find this notion of soft power or structural power, we might even call it social power, as opposed to the more typical notion of power as money, weapons, the ability to bribe or to hurt?